Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the human potential movement and the Esalen Institute. My guest is British music journalist and author of the Wobot blog, Matthew Ingram. He is also author of Retreat, How the Counterculture Invented Wellness. Matthew is in London, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Thanks very much for having me back, Jeffrey.
We're going to talk now about the human potential movement and the Esalen Institute. Our previous conversation was about the counterculture, and these are two distinct but overlapping movements. Maybe it would be a good idea to begin by trying to separate them. To what distinguishes human potential from the counterculture?
Well, the best way I think to look at the two of them is to imagine that they both spring from the same sources or similar sources. There's a lot of crossover between the sources. But the human potential movement essentially grew out of a conjecture of Aldous Huxley's, where he described the latent possibilities in mankind. And in a lecture, he referred to it as human potentialities. And this was picked up by Murphy and Price at Esalen. The counterculture is more directly comes through the beat movement, but in the sense that obviously Aldous Huxley was a very big influence, but also that Indian philosophy and Eastern philosophy was a big influence. There's a great confluence between the two.
And I know you point out in your book how Michael Murphy and Dick Price, the founders of the Esalen Institute, were students at Stanford University attending lectures by Frederic Spiegelberg, who had gotten deeply involved in esoteric traditions of India. I believe he was a student, perhaps even a disciple of Ramana Maharshi, a famous guru.
Yes. Spiegelberg was a lecturer at Stanford and famously inspired Michael Murphy. He wandered into one of his lectures by accident. But Spiegelberg was a sort of has a remarkable, almost itinerant part. He's almost like a Zelig-like character because he appears with Jung in Switzerland. But also he visited and stayed at Aurobindo's ashram in Pune, where with Mother, but also I think he met Aurobindo. I think he was probably still alive at that stage. And he took darshan from Aurobindo, but he also took darshan from Maharshi, which is remarkable. So he's a sort of academic who's got roots in Jungianism, but also has met all these gurus, which is Jung didn't even manage to do, or wasn't inclined to do when he went to India. And so he was a great, hugely inspired Murphy.
But you describe this incredible lecture where he's saying to the students, Atman is Brahman. It's a famous equation in the Hindu tradition, and he's sort of yelling at the students, get it? And apparently Michael Murphy got it at that moment.
Yes, I mean, it sounds like a remarkable sort of epiphany. It's the famous Sanskrit what can be distilled in the famous Sanskrit saying "Tat Tvam Asi," which means thou art that, and it's the fundamental idea that the ego is a subsection essentially of the self, and so there's two really good analogies that describe it, which is to say that the air in a jar is kind of contiguous with the air in the atmosphere. So that we're sort of as egos, we're just containers of consciousness and sort of artificial containers in a sense. And there's another great analogy of salt going into water in the Upanishads, and so I think it's Svetlana his father says to him, he says, "Can you see the salt in the water?" And Esalen said, "No." He says, "Well, that is the same. Thou art that. This is the salt manifests is the consciousness, is the cream in the milk, so to speak."
So the idea essentially is that within each human being, if we can probe deeply enough, we are one with the whole universe.
That's right. Our consciousness is essentially just a fragment of the collective unconscious, or the self, or the psyche, or however we like to look at it. Yes.
You talk about how Dick Price, who co-founded Esalen with Michael Murphy, experienced what was diagnosed as a psychotic break. He had mental treatment. He had electroshock therapy. It was quite severe, but he also arrived at the notion that this was not a breakdown, but a breakthrough, and was very much in alignment with the anti-psychiatry movement that we spoke about briefly last time.
He was on North Beach as a beatnik, and he was in a bar, and he started. He'd been getting higher and higher over a period of weeks, and he started telling the barman, "Light the fire, light the fire, light the fire." And then I think the guy running the bar called the mental institute, and then he was confined. But yes, he thought of it as a healing crisis, and he wanted to that was similar to how R.D. Laing and Jung as well, for instance, viewed the situation of the mental breakdown as a kind of refashioning of the ego. But unfortunately, he actually I think he spent months with these huge kind of energies coursing through him, and in conventional terms, having a severe psychiatric breakdown. But he felt that it was sort of a spiritual experience, and he pretty much got to the end of it and was going to be discharged. And his father basically committed him. And so he then had to go through and have a very intensive period of electric shock treatment and treatment with Thorazine. And it was at that stage, sadly, that the damage was done. Apparently, quite severe damage to his brain showed up, on his autopsy. He was always very interested in this idea of breakdown as breakthrough.
Well, there's also a relationship here to the Spiritual Emergence Network, which eventually was created by Stanislav Grof and his wife Christine, both of whom were connected to the Esalen Institute.
Stan moved to Esalen in about 1973, and Christina joined him there in 1975, I think it is. And she had what they termed at the time, it was called a Kundalini experience. Kundalini was the big metaphor that was used to describe this. As a book by Elisa Nella, who I think somebody who you knew, I think, in the past.
He was a good friend.
There's other sort of key texts on the Kundalini experience, but they imagined with the Spiritual Emergence Network, the idea was that this experience was happening more and more. I think probably against the background of a culture where more people were doing psychedelics, more people were exploring, other altered states of consciousness, and so the Kundalini experience, which is, in another sense, is as another word for what we might just call a nervous breakdown, but has specific factors like what they call kriyas, which are shuddering. And hallucinations and hearing things, but I think the idea with the Spiritual Emergency Network was to view these as transformational crises, and not to medicate people, essentially.
Well, Stanislav Grof is a very interesting figure because he bridges both the psychedelic movement and the human potential movement, sort of both a countercultural icon and a human potential icon.
He's a titan in many ways. he's, I guess, maybe most known or most associated with transpersonal psychology, which was sort of the movement that he saw growing out of humanist psychology. But also, obviously now, especially in this current climate where psychedelics are a hot ticket, he's obviously known. He's a sort of a patron saint of Rick Doblin's maps as well. I think he's very involved there. But yes, it was a great opportunity to interview him for the book, and I know, Jeffrey, that you've interviewed him at least twice over the years. But extraordinary character, yes.
I knew Stan Grof quite well. In fact, it's funny now that you mention it. We were planning to do an extensive series of interviews with Stan Grof, something akin to the Bill Moyers, Joseph Campbell interviews with Campbell. And we were about to do it when his house caught fire and burned the very day that we were scheduled to do those interviews. So that never happened.
Perhaps it wasn't supposed to be. Who knows?
The truth is I've been involved with the Esalen Institute and a related organization, which I think is very central to the human potential movement, the Association for Humanistic Psychology, going back to the 1970s.
The key figure in referring to that would probably be Abraham Maslow, who's obviously, central to the Esalen story. His Towards the Psychology of Being, I know, was one of the key texts, along with the Gestalt therapy book, and he's obviously known for his peak experiences and a very important figure in Esalen.
Abraham Maslow was a crucial figure. I remember in 1969 when I came out to California from, I'd been working at a mental health center in Illinois, and I quit my job after 6 weeks, and because they were too behaviorally oriented, I came out to California, and the first thing that I wanted to do was to meet Abraham Maslow, who was working at a think tank at the time in Palo Alto. So I had a meeting with him, and it's interesting because he's such an important figure. We had a good conversation. I was hoping he might have a job for me. I really wanted to study with him at the time, but he looked at me and he saw my long hair, and I was a student protester, and he said he wasn't very sympathetic with long-haired student protesters. He was still he was an old school person, still part of, I guess in those days, what they would have called the silent majority at the time, even though he had been, very influential in inspiring the whole human potential movement.
I certainly know that the Esalen, the culture of Esalen is not as radical as the culture of the counterculture. And perhaps that's what he noticed in you, Jeffrey, that you were more radical in that sense.
Those were young and crazy years. I would have been maybe 21, 22 years old at the time, and still discovering myself, and certainly swept up in the whole, student activism, hippie movement of that era, but deeply interested in Maslow's work and human potential at the time. Out of the human potential movement, and Maslow was a key figure bridging these, came the transpersonal psychology movement. The same people who founded the Association for Humanistic Psychology felt that they hadn't gone far enough, and they also founded the Association for Transpersonal Psychology, Maslow being among them.
Stan Grof has famously said that it was his idea, or it was a phrase that he'd actually used in one of his papers. And I think Maslow was going to be calling it transhumanist, but then I think the transpersonal, which was Stan Grof's term, was the one that they went with. That's right, and that's the much more profound implications, in a way, a lot closer to not a conventional, but sort of a more like a Eastern philosophy with an emphasis on things that, you might see as being paranormal. So reincarnation and spirits and that whole extra factor that, that psychologies tend to sort of gingerly tiptoe around. Even Jung will sort of hedge his bets in that kind of area if he can.
You quote, for example, Jeffrey Kripal in his classic book on the Esalen Institute, in which he pointed out that the whole field of comparative religions started burgeoning across colleges and universities throughout the world around the same time as the human potential movement was taking off, and this interest in Zen Buddhism and meditation began to flourish in the Western world. Yes,
and even humanist psychology had a great debt to Eastern thought. The ideas, Maslow's ideas, even as they were, humanist philosophy, were very much indebted to Buddhism and Taoism especially. This idea, and the same with Gestalt therapy. I think it could be summarized as the idea that the machine works, which is the idea, for instance, that the human body, if left to its own devices, and encouraged in a kind of a natural state, will not create neurosis or problems. So this idea, and that very much came from Taoism, the idea of, not interrupting, seeing how things fall, trusting in, that one's natural instincts and urges and intuitions. So, even before, comparative religion and, transpersonal psychology became, involved, there was already that idea of, the importance of Eastern philosophy.
You make a very interesting point in your book of comparing the Gestalt therapy as practiced by Fritz Perls, the founder, and it was a huge movement in its own day, with Taoism. And I think there's a very interesting way in which you make the comparison, because you say Perls was never really able to articulate what Gestalt therapy was about. Even though he wrote books about it, they never seemed to be clear. Even when you quote Theodore Roszak, who is much more articulate, describing Gestalt therapy, I found it almost unintelligible. But in Taoism, they say, the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao. Anyone who claims they understand the Tao is wrong.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a way to give Perls a break for his unintelligibility. But Roszak, he's very good on it in a sense that he comes up with a similar. Well, I mean, that quote that the machine works is very much how Roszak perceives how it works, which is that what we tend to do in modern life is to over medicalize ourselves. We take a pill to get up, we take a pill to do that, we're neurotic, we tailor our behavior constantly, and I think Roszak's insight on Perls's idea was that really that it was about breaking those accoutrements, those behaviors that we've learned to get back to a natural state of being. So there's a great quote that, and obviously that plays a big part in that, is the Reichian ideas of body armor. So when the Reichian massage, and so for instance when someone like Ida Rolf at Esalen was doing it, was about breaking the body armor, restoring the value of gravity, which was Ida Rolf's great simplification of really the body needs to obey gravity. And there's a very sort of one of the Fritz Perls' few cosmic moments is when he reflects that that really gravity is God, because obviously it's just that naturalness which I think he was trying to induce in his therapy.
You're right. There was a huge emphasis on the body itself. And I remember my very first exposure to the Esalen Institute was when I was working at this mental health center in Illinois, in Rockford, Illinois, based on behavior therapy, which I reacted strongly against. But I found a book at that time by Bernie Gunther, who was one of the program leaders at the Esalen Institute, called Sensory Awareness. And it was all about just getting in touch with your body. Apparently, up until that time, the thinking was, going back to the 19th century, as I recall, that you shouldn't be aware of your body at all, except if you're ill or sick, that a healthy body is one you don't feel rather than one that you're aware of. And there grew this sense of the enormous potentiality just within the nervous system.
It's very nice. It links from basically with Freud as well, in the sense that, he too believed that, if there was such a thing as the ego, it was the body, it was the formation of the body. So Reich's idea as well really was that, that rather than in a Freudian sense that, trauma is something in our memories or in our past, it's really something that we hold in our bodies. And the idea in that as well that, the mind is a physical brain. It's like a memory bank, capturing a life in that sense. So that the problem is with the formation of that body. And so obviously with Reich, there was the Reichian therapists now will praise Reich for his emphasis on breathing and teaching breathing and how he would notice breathing in his students, and also obviously his work on body armor and how people would hold positions. But it's very interesting that you encountered Bernie Gunther when you did, because he was obviously one of the key group leaders at Esalen.
I had this interesting experience. I was working in the Singer Zone Center in Rockford, Illinois, in a unit that had very severely long-term clients, people who had been housed in mental health institutions, big warehouses at the time, for sometimes decades. And I was working with a group of people. One woman in the group hadn't spoken in years. She was practically catatonic. And I found this exercise in Bernie Gunther's book of a sensory awareness. So people were just tapping their heads like this gently and experiencing it. And this lady started talking after one experience of that. Yeah.
There's very, very powerful techniques. I mean, there's some wonderful, the encounter techniques, and the techniques are fascinating. And there's in relation to the body, Will Schutz was one of the other big leaders with Pearls and Gunther. Will Schutz was one of the big leaders who wrote a book called Joy. And one of his things was with the group encounter, one of the techniques was doubling, whereby you would copy the body position of somebody else in the group. And by doing that, I think people would get an insight into what their problems were. But again, it's that kind of working backwards from, where the body is positioned, or how trauma or guilt or all these things are held in the body, and being able to kind of get in touch with that by a game. So there's wonderful things that came through that process.
There was a sense of playfulness. It was very exploratory, and people love making up games and getting together in groups and just exploring the edges of human potential through games. It was a wonderful time. It certainly extended beyond just California. When I was in Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin as an undergrad, one of my professors there, David Bradford, was the son of Leland Bradford, who was in Maine, who was the founder of what was known as the encounter group phenomenon. And encounter groups really were a huge fad sweeping through the country in the 1960s, and sort of led to all kinds of other group therapies, including, I think, Gestalt therapy.
there's a fascinating history to the encounter group. So I think, from what I understand, is that they came out of sensitivity training, which was actually for businesses. And I think apparently what happened was that, if you were having a problem with your workforce, you get them all together and you discuss, the situations. But apparently what they did is that they made a kind of a slightly radical move and decided that they would actually ask the people in to come to attend the assessment, so that everybody got to actually talk about not only what the teachers were saying, but what they were saying about everybody else. And apparently that was supposedly one of the starting points of the encounter group. And I know that that Will Schutz, for instance, used that at Esalen, used that as the template for bunging a load of different stuff, games and other stuff, into that structure. And I recently saw the Hollywood movie, which actually Quentin Tarantino has been is a great fan of. Bob, Carol, Ted, and Alice, and they show a lot of the fictional setting, but they show a lot of the games happening in an institute, which is obviously a copy of Esalen, and that must have been seen right away across America. So the whole thing must have been widely experienced and understood.
The impact, I think, still goes on today. David Bradford, who was my professor at Madison in psychology, got hired by Stanford University's School of Business. And one of his famous books in that context was a book about how you could be influential at any level in the corporation. You didn't have to be the CEO to be a decision maker or a person of influence. That was an outgrowth of the encounter group and sensitivity training movements.
I personally find it very interesting, also on a slightly comic level, how there's that crossover between the business world and the spirituality world. I do find it, looking back at it, amusing, and I'm doing a lot of research on that area at the moment. But something, for instance, like EST was almost very explicitly about getting on in the world and prospering in business, and but it took a lot of the ideas of Taoism, Zen Buddhism, Gestalt therapy, and took them that way. So yeah, interesting, very interesting.
Today, for example, you have an outgrowth of the Association for Transpersonal Psychology. Was a small college called the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. I was on the faculty there back in the 1980s and maybe even 70s. And it went through a crisis. It got purchased by new owners. It's in Silicon Valley still. It's now called Sophia University, and they have two tracks. One is for the Silicon Valley business community, and the other is the same transpersonal psychology track. They're kind of coming together.
Side by side. How interesting.
You also mentioned Ida Rolf earlier, who had this idea similar to Reich about working with the body armor. It was deep tissue massage as a way of breaking down the body armor. And it reminded me of an episode in my life I had almost forgotten. I was actually Rolfed by Ida Rolf.
How amazing. Gosh, Jeffrey, you never cease to surprise me. That's did she give you a heart attack?
Oh, I screamed so loud at one time because there was a part of the process where she takes her fingers right up your nostrils. And I felt like I was being raped. And I was screaming bloody murder, and she was encouraging me. Scream, she said, go ahead and scream. They could hear me a quarter of a mile away at one of the other houses there. This was in 1973, and I was a model for her training. She was training her senior Rolfing students at the time and using me as her guinea pig.
Did she use her elbows? Is that was one of the things I think she did?
Yeah, I had the complete Rolfing. I think it was 13 sessions or something along those lines.
Because there's the famous story at Esalen of how she basically Rolfed for its pearls, didn't she? And she nearly killed him. I think he passed out for 15 minutes, and he had a very weak heart, and she was frightened that she killed him. But then he came to, and I think felt much better. I think he was greatly appreciated it.
Well, in that time, there was a sense with Pearls, and I think with Ida Rolf too, of I guess you'd have to call it therapeutic tyranny. There was a sense in which some of these processes that were experimental and playful also could become abusive.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because certainly I know that with Pearls and with the encounter groups, that's something that's been phased out of Esalen's own history. So, for instance, if you read the Walter Truett Anderson book on Esalen, it talks a lot about encounter groups. But Kripal, on his book on Esalen, which is more recent, mentions them a lot less. And I think that's it's very much something that's been phased out. And the reason being that there were a lot of suicides. And I know it's Jacqueline Gold and Marcia Price, who were both women who had been in therapy with Pearls, and he'd been extremely brutal to them. Both committed suicide. I think one of them, I think it's Jacqueline Gold, was an extremely tragic story, which was more directly related to Pearls. I think Pearls goaded her and said, she was like, I'm going to commit suicide, you've got to stop this. And he was like, go on, go and kill yourself, see if I care. And actually there's, I think, transcriptions. They actually filmed it, and there's actually transcriptions of this happening. And he willingly released the tapes of the process where he's goading her. So I think that eventually, I think there's a whole bunch of suicides, some more directly related to Esalen and encounter groups, some around the peripheries of people who attended Esalen. But I think there was a lot of it was a brutal, for some people obviously a wonderful experience, but for a minority I think it was a dangerous mode of therapy.
It's not so dissimilar from the experience of using psychedelic drugs. People were really pushing the limits of what might be possible. And there were many positive breakthroughs. I have to say, in my own case, I participated in a variety of dangerous activities and came out just fine. But certainly there were casualties.
I suppose one should resist making, facile reductions or assumptions, but my gut feeling is that when there is a lot of trauma, or a really hidden or undealt with or unanswered emotional problems, I think that they can be cataclysmic situations. There's a very interesting someone who I talked to in my book, called a man called Scott Hill, who was actually living in and around California at the same time. He was a participant in the counterculture, like you would have been. He took LSD very merrily, and there's on a number of occasions. But then I think actually went up the Big Sur coast, so again actually quite close to Esalen, and on his own one day thought, he's going to have a lovely day tripping. And it literally, I think, the gates of hell opened. And his theory, and I think it's a reasonable conjecture, that he'd actually had, I think, third-degree burns as an infant, and that this was he was actually getting in touch with that experience. And so, if you have a traumatic experience like that you don't usually have any ability to get in touch with, and then suddenly with LSD or again with extreme therapy, you're able to confront it. It can be an overwhelming experience.
That was certainly the case for people on LSD, and I think in very therapeutic situations as well. In particular, because people were coming for a weekend experience at Esalen, or maybe a week-long experience. What they probably really needed was long-term treatment to deal with these situations.
Yes. I think I did read that one of the things that they actually they did have some sort of 4-month programs at Esalen in the old days, but I think apparently that they found that although that would suggest that we were going to have time to, acclimatize people to the therapy, but actually I think the further you went in, then, the further you got out. So I think they still tend nowadays to do quite short courses on the basis that people aren't going to go too far into these traumas that, that everything's going to, fall apart for them when the period's over. So I guess it's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of another.
Well, you write about the critiques. People like Tom Wolfe, is it Christopher Lasch, wrote these books very critical of Esalen and all of these new therapies and the sense. I remember very well people wanted instant gratification, and at one time there was a documentary done in Marin County, California, which was also a human potential hotspot, where a woman was in a hot tub, and she had men around her with peacock feathers stroking her, and she was saying, "I want it all now."
Yeah, that's a very famous, isn't it? I think that was the part of the backlash, wasn't it? I think they filmed people, and yes, and I think that it was something that I think was made to. It was quite easy to lampoon it. But yes, there was a sort of slow and steady backlash. There was a writer called Sam Keane who was sort of part of the ranks of Esalen, and he was one of the first people to sort of say, well, look, come on, hang on, everybody's so content with sorting out their own problems, but what about the problems of the world? And then I think what happened was that then that critique was picked up by more opportunistic people. So the next one was for Tom Wolfe, who wrote a very famous article, I think it's for Vanity Fair, called The Me Decade, a 30-page article as they were in that stage. But Wolfe doesn't really understand the culture. He doesn't really understand the ideas behind it. In a way that actually he's much more sympathetic in something like the electric Kool-Aid acid test. He understands LSD, but or he's up close to it. But I think at this stage he's not really that invested in it, and he just sees it as something that's selfish. But certainly in the Me Decade article, he refers at great length to Fritz Perls' encounter sessions and goes on and describes them in great. But Fritz Perls never did encounter sessions. That was Will Schutz who did encounter sessions. So he just didn't have a clue. It was basically really bad journalism. And then that is picked up by Christopher Lasch, who writes a whole book. And Christopher Lasch really has no idea about, it's all, the critique is on what you might be described as that impulse to be here now. Bhagavan Das's famous statement. That's a critique that it's all about nowness. But obviously, in that impulse of nowness, there was inherently as well a kind of an ethical dimension to that, in that the idea was that you were in the present in the moment, but that you were, in the present in the moment and doing the right thing. But that aspect of certainly the counterculture, which had a very sort of strong ethical dimension, is just removed from the equation in those critiques. It's almost like the revenge of the establishment.
Well, it did seem like that to me, because in the 1980s we had the Reagan years and kind of a cultural backlash against the counterculture movement. But at the same time, certainly in my case, people with a very serious interest in humanistic and transpersonal psychology, people like Stan Grof and others, were continuing their work. Another important figure of that era is John Lilly, who I think we spoke about last time, but he also was part of the Esalen Institute and the Human Potential movement.
That's right. And actually, funnily enough, I think it's he's actually not essential to the Esalen story as they tell it than I think he should be, really, because the Deep Self, his famous book, is written pretty much about the experiments that he did at Esalen. And there's a lot of what they call tank reports, which is basically almost everybody who was on the Esalen grounds and their experiences, in the tank with him at Esalen. But absolutely, it's very much part of that culture. I don't even think they have isolation tanks at the moment, which is a sort of missed opportunity, really, because on a commercial level, I'm sure it would be they'd have a sort of tradition to call upon.
Well, I believe tanks are still around elsewhere, but you have, in the case of John Lilly and also Stanislav Grof, an effort to take the peak experience that people experienced through LSD and other psychedelics and try to replicate it without using drugs. Yes,
yeah. I mean, that's the nub of the thing, and I think that's certainly when we talk about the flotation tanks. That's, I mean, from the film Altered States, I know we're all familiar with William Hurt doing LSD and being in a tank, but the idea was that being in a tank on its own was a psychedelic experience. Certainly, Stan Grof, actually, his tank reports are extremely imaginative, and he looks like, I don't think he was necessarily taking acid at the time. And obviously with Grof, there's the whole thing with the holotropic breathwork, which is about reaching these same states of consciousness through hyperventilation, and that itself, actually, that comes from I think via Leonard Orr. I think he was one of the first people to make it famous. But there's a yogic technique, bellows breath. I think it's Bastrika, and that's it described it, in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika as being the fastest way to arouse Kundalini. So they've always known that this was how to trip out naturally. I think so. And obviously, but to go back to Lilly, I mean, his big thing was DMT as well. And I know there's the famous story of him at Esalen being given DMT in the tank and curing his migraines. He visualizes migraines first of all, sort of a few feet above his head, and then they come back, and then like sort of 20 meters above his head, and then they come back, and then they dose him up with a absolutely massive dose, and his migraine just goes off over the horizon and never comes back.
Now, you mentioned Leonard Orr in passing a moment ago. As I recall, he was associated with a related movement called rebirthing.
Yes. And that was something that R.D. Laing, I think, tried to get on the coattails of as well. I suppose that would be gets into the terrain where it's sort of on the edges of, because I kept my research quite close to the counterculture, but certainly with Grof's work with the perinatal matrices, there's a very strong sense of the importance of that, the idea of birth and rebirth, and so Stan would see certain LSD experiences as being related to certain stages of people's experience in the birth canal. So, BP 1 to 4. Obviously the whole idea of, individuation in that sense is wrapped up with the idea of rebirth. So not just like, I think Orr did workshops where people would act out birthing and rebirthing.
People would, in effect, relive their birth experience and would come out of it feeling, in a sense, reborn, almost like in the fundamentalist Christian sense.
Yes, and I suppose it's one of the things that comes up repeatedly in LSD experiences is people's remembering the birth experience. And I think in dream work as well, people can find dreams that have strong echoes or suggestions of the birth experience. So yes.
Another aspect, I don't think you wrote about it so much in your book, but it came out of the Esalen Institute, were conferences on physics and consciousness. This a whole new effort to, understand the nature of consciousness itself. There was actually, I guess it's fair to say, quite a bit of intellectual work that came out of various Esalen conferences.
The Frederic is the famous the Tao of Physics, isn't it? That was the famous book. I know that certainly a lot of the New Age movement takes a lot of succor from the ideas of quantum physics, and it's quite difficult to know exactly what position to take on something like that, because it can end up in a terrible gobbledygook. But certainly something like David Bohm, I know, was extremely important. The physicist David Bohm, and I know that he spent a lot of time in conversation with Krishnamurti. And Bohm was a physicist at the very highest level. So he was working on the atom bomb. So yes, and Esalen also is uncredited. A lot of the workshops, they did a number of workshops on race as well. I think somebody you spoke to a long time ago, Price Cobbs, the black psychiatrist, he worked with George Leonard out of Esalen, and they did a number of racial encounter groups that were explosive, but on every time they did them, I think that with a really excellent resolution.
Well, Price Cobbs, I remember him, was a very elegant man. You also mentioned George Leonard, who was, I think, one of the co-founders of the Esalen Institute. Very interesting person. I recall his book, Education in Ecstasy, in which he points out that in mainstream educational institutions, children are going to learn more and will have an easier time of it if they are able to experience the joy of learning in different ways. I think that book was very influential.
Yes, I mean, it seems like there might be echoes of it in something like Daniel Goleman's ideas of actually, educating children, in psychology in a sense. And I know that that's something that Adler was always very big on, was educating children, to be psychological, to understand psychology.
The whole emotional intelligence movement.
Goleman's, exactly, yes. He saw that as happening very much through education.
Well, there are just many, many points of contact, certainly parapsychology. And you've also referred now to a couple of Hollywood movies, but I think there were any number of movies that featured what was going on, because human potential at that time and even today, it was just an enormous cultural thread that sort of wove through everything.
The Esalen Institute took a little, a sort of a mini Esalen showcase to Hollywood, and had a lot of movie starlets and everything came down. And I think that Natalie Wood, the actress, did an encounter group with Fritz Perls, and I think he went off the rails a bit and picked her up and started smacking her. She was absolutely, I think Malcolm McDowell threatened to beat in Perls on her behalf, but she was obviously the star for she was Carol in Bob Carroll, Ted and Alice. So there's people have conjectured that she was having her revenge cold. But actually, it's actually a very positive film about the encounter movement. So yeah.
And you mentioned altered states. There's a wonderful line in that movie. He plays a professor, as I recall, I think a Harvard professor interested in consciousness. And he's walking down the street with one of his colleagues and talking about the whole field of consciousness and how there isn't much good work except for Tart. He mentions Charlie Tart, who was one of my dissertation committee members at the time.
You just did a stream thing with Charles Tart, didn't you?
I just did, yes, a couple of days ago. I've known Charlie for 50 years, and as I mentioned, he was one of my dissertation committee members.
Yes, that's funny. That's amazing. Yeah, it's funny that it entered those areas. Absolutely extraordinary. I'm trying to think of more examples. I think there was a few. I think there were a few more trashy films towards the end when it became more of a target. I think those were probably the best examples.
Well, sure. There were all kinds of movies. I don't know that there were ever any good movies, but as I recall, Altered States was written by Paddy Chayefsky, who was a very well-known screenwriter.
Yes, that's right. He had a big fight with. I know that the production of that film was a nightmare. They had a terrible fight on set. I think that he was thrown off the movie in the end. There's a lot of things in comic books as well. I know that, for instance, the comic book artist Moebius and Jodorowsky, of course, was again very much into this field. The Holy Mountain is very much related to this terrain too.
I'm a big fan of Jodorowsky's films and his illustrated novels and his work he calls it psychomagic. He attempted to combine his interest in surrealism and tarot with psychotherapy.
Yes, it's all very Jungian, isn't it? And he's a fascinating character. And still a reputation. I think Kanye West wanted to meet him just the other day, so he's still a hot ticket, Jodorowsky.
He's nearly 90 years old at this point and going strong. I have enormous admiration for him. Yeah. So it's very interesting that many of the people who were back there at the very beginning, people like Michael Murphy, for example, are still active and making contributions to the world in a very serious way.
Yes. And I think it's some measure it's one of the things that I realized when I was writing the book that if I was to do something like this on 60s rock stars, most of them would be dead by this stage. There's a Paul McCartney and Bob Dylan still kicking around. There's the healthier ones, but a lot of the big famous ones are dead. But again, a lot of the 60s era and the countercultural era in this particular era are alive and kicking. And I know Michael Murphy's had a long career, and the sports thing that he's always worked on has always been very interesting. I know he wrote the book Golf in the Kingdom, which is about the sort of the golfing yogi Shivas Irons, and he wrote another book, The Psychic Side of Sports, which is I think that's such an interesting area actually as well. I think it's one of the most unexplored aspects of this culture, and potentially very interesting things that have been left unexplored in that area, certainly.
And I think he still pursues his interest in meditation and Aurobindo. In fact, just 2 days ago, I interviewed my friend Debashish Banerjee. He was in Calcutta. Debashish has written many books about Aurobindo, and he's in regular contact with Michael Murphy. And
yes, I know that Aurobindo was the absolute, the life divine was the absolute key to Murphy, and it's very interesting because I have seen your interviews with Debashish actually, and it's very interesting. But the Aurobindo, it's easy to, for instance, lump all of the Advaita Vedanta theorists together, but Aurobindo is very different. He has this sense of integration, famously, which is to refer back to Esalen is the fundamental thing with Esalen, which is it's not all about, like everybody did in the counterculture, going off to the moon. It's that sense of bringing it all back, being a united person, having the access to the notions of these higher realms of experience, but also being able to be a person walking around in the world. And so Aurobindo, I'm glad you mentioned him as a very, very important
Well, also because one of the critiques you brought up of the human potential movement is the idea that people are just staring at their navels while the world is falling apart. And you see, in the Aurobindo's movement, a real emphasis on making a contribution to society. I did a lovely interview with Debashish about the community of Auroville in India, which is sort of a model community that has political and financial aspects to it, as well as spiritual and economic and psychological.
Yes, I mean it's what unfortunately happened with a lot of the Eastern philosophy. Certainly, when it went to the West, was that it was used in a way to just literally take off into the self and forget the reality of the world around us. I think the brightest people or the most compassionate people figured it out, but unfortunately, there were casualties, the likes of Leary, unfortunately, who just all they could see was the distant planets and not the world they were living in.
Well, the Esalen Institute is still active after all of these years. So many other organizations of that type don't last this long. It'll probably keep going for a long time.
I think until it falls into the sea. Yes, I mean it's. I know I'm certain you will have been there, but if anybody has the opportunity to go there and go on a workshop, I strongly recommend it. It's heaven on earth. It's absolutely beautiful. It's funny because when you travel to it as someone from Europe, you go literally right away west, and then you go west and west and west and west, and in fact you're so far west that you might as well be in the east. Certainly how I felt it.
You could say that it is the very furthest extension of Western civilization, if you don't count Hawaii.
Hawaii. Yes.
Well, Matthew, this has been a delightful conversation. I'm so glad that we can revisit this era because it was crucial in my own development and people of my generation. And I think that it's an impulse culturally that is still making waves.
Yes, and well, thank you very much indeed for having me. And it's an era that I find endlessly fascinating, and it's fantastic to be able to talk to you. And you tell me that you've been Rolf by Ida Rolf. I mean, it's remarkable. So thank you very much for having me, Jeffrey. I much appreciate it.
Well, I hope and expect that we will be doing more interviews as well, because as I look at the depth of your writing and the breadth of your writing and the brilliance of your writing, I'd like to have more conversations with you, Matthew.
Well, that would be a great honor. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you.
And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.